Cryptography, from the Greek word kryptos meaning secret, is a process which information is transformed from its original state to other using a predefined algorithm. Ideally, the resultant information is devoid of meaning, except to those who possess privileged knowledge, generally called the key. The algorithm used to transform the information is called the cipher. The original unmodified message is called plain text, and the result of the encryption process is called ciphertext. One of the oldest ciphers is the Caesar cipher, used by the Greeks to securely transmit messages on the battlefield. The Caesar cipher works by simply shifting the alphabet a certain number of characters. Say, for example, we wanted to encrypt the plain text message, "Attack at dawn." We would begin by defining our keys, say 3 shifts. We would then encrypt one letter at a time, thus A becomes D, and so on and so forth, until the message is completely encrypted, resulting in our ciphertext. Used by the German army during World War II to securely transmit messages, the Enigma machine was the pinnacle of electromechanical encryption schemes. The machine utilized 3 moving rotors to encrypt messages. As each individual letter is encrypted, the rotors advance 1 position, so even if 2 identical plaintext letters are encrypted, their corresponding ciphertext will be different. Additional entropy was introduced using a switchboard and plugs that could be used to swap letters. The starting position of the rotors and switchboard was the key. If synchronized with the message sender, the receiver could successfully decrypt the messages with ease. Assuming an attacker had an Enigma machine in his possession, there were 2 to the 76 power combinations, an infeasible number for any mechanical device to attempt each time a message was sent. In the early part of the war, the Allies relied on captured codebooks, which contained the keys for the German Enigmas to decrypt messages. It wasn't until later in the war that the encryption scheme began to be regularly broken by Alan Turing, a British mathematician who would later become known as the father of computer science. Turing leveraged a flaw in the design of the Enigma. Looking at the ciphertext only, he was able to rule out certain rotors that could not be used to produce the captured ciphertext. This substantially reduced the possible number of starting positions. Then, using primitive computers called bombes, the remaining key space could be brute forced. Governments have always been heavily involved in the use of cryptography, sometimes to send secure messages to embassies, other times to eavesdrop on dissidents. For the most part, governments always had the upper hand with virtually limitless resources. Most modern nation-states could always break the encryption schemes available to the public and private sector. Governments such as the United States closely guarded their ciphers. Until the late 90s, encryption using keys larger than 40 bits in the United States was considered a munition. Any company or individual who wanted to sell their encryption software outside the United States was required to purchase the same license required to sell tanks, guns, bombs, and other armaments. At the time, state officials claimed that releasing strong encryption to the public would hinder law enforcement.
Strong crypto is already out. It's known by everyone. It's understood very well. There's books on the subject. And if we start putting backdoors into commonly used software, criminals are still going to use strong cryptographic systems because everybody knows how they work. And you're only punishing people who have not committed a crime. There's example after example of the executive branch, particularly in the United States, abusing privileges just like this that have been granted them in the past. For example, the warrantless spying program conducted by the NSA in the mid-2000s.
The data encryption standard was chosen by the National Security Agency and was derived from an earlier cipher called the Lucifer cipher. However, prior to its publication, the NSA made a few changes to the way the cipher worked. This raised suspicion at the time, and thereafter the American academic communities became involved in the practice of cryptography. In 1990, almost 15 years after DES was originally standardized, Eli Bram and Adi Shamir published a paper on the weaknesses they had found in the DES cipher called differential cryptanalysis. Interestingly, the original Lucifer cipher, on which DES was based, was not vulnerable to this type of attack. It stands to reason that the NSA knew about this attack and deliberately weakened the DES cipher in such a way that they could break the keys using an attack that would not be discovered until over a decade later. This backdoor allowed the NSA and other government organizations to access any secure communications. Some viewed this as a direct violation of the US citizens' right to privacy.
But there's a difference between privacy and secrecy. For example, when you go to a store and try on clothes, you close the dressing room door, and it's not because people don't know what you're doing, it's because closing the door adds this level of privacy that we have grown accustomed to.
In 1991, a computer scientist named Philip Zimmermann wrote a program called Pretty Good Privacy. However, Zimmermann risked being arrested for arms dealing if he published or distributed his software. This is an interesting dilemma because unlike traditional weapons, PGP was software, an intangible abstract object. You could not hold software in your hand like you do a gun. Nonetheless, under the law, you can be as guilty as a man distributing a truck full of Kalashnikovs. To get around this problem, Zimmermann published a hardcover book containing nothing more than the PGP source code. Instead of distributing the actual software, he distributed the book. In spite of this, Zimmermann was subject of a 1993 investigation for exporting weapons without a license. After testimony by dissidents in foreign countries who use PGP to communicate securely under oppressive regimes, Zimmermann was eventually found not guilty. Today, PGP is no longer considered weapons grade. Encryption is a double-edged sword. If you make it publicly available as a secure means to communicate, you are giving that ability to any potential adversary.
It enables people with malicious intents to get away with things that would otherwise easily be found if we didn't have it. These people with malicious intents would be able to read our plaintext data.
Brute force attacks against 256-bit keys will be infeasible until computers are built from something other than matter and occupy something other than space. For the first time in history, everyday individuals have access to completely unbreakable encryption. This major shift has only occurred in the last 10 years.
The interesting thing about modern cryptography is that there's no secrets. Everybody understands how these ciphers work. They're unbreakable purely on the fact that it is infeasible mathematically to accomplish something.
In recent news, it was revealed that due to a large oversight in Sony's encryption method for signing executables on the PlayStation 3, a group of hackers known as Fail Overflow were able to determine Sony's private keys.
Okay, so the thing we're trying to do is figure out the private key they use to put signature on all the files. You normally cannot do that, of course, that's why it's a good crypto system. In ECDSA there's a lot of parameters that are public, that P, A, B, G, N, Q, E, R, S, whatever. But there are two things that are private in a single signature. That's K, the private key, which we want to have, and it's M, which is supposed to be a random number. Okay, next slide. Okay, so how does someone who signs something calculate the numbers R and S, which are the signature? Well, R is done by scalar multiplication of base point of the elliptic curve, blah, 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 difficult stuff. It's the difficult problem that that's the base of the security of all elliptic curve crypto. But S is just calculated as normal numbers. Well, so that first equation we cannot solve. No one in the world can solve it, so let's just ignore it. But the second equation, it's got two unknowns in it now, K and M, so we cannot solve for it either. But M is supposed to be a random number, and for some reason Sony uses the same random number all the time.
This allows anyone with the private key, which has now been publicly disclosed, to publish and run their own code on the PlayStation 3 without purchasing a license from Sony. This is a problem for Sony because the consoles are sold at a loss, but Sony has traditionally made their money back by selling licenses to game companies. Now that anyone can publish games, this revenue stream may become delinquent over time. This breach can also allow individuals to run illegal copies of existing games, though the authors of this hack have publicly denounced this type of activity. Sony has since claimed that this type of activity is illegal under the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, or DMCA, which prevents any circumvention of copy-protected devices. The question still remains: was it ethical from the members of Fail Overflow to release this exploit, knowing it would cause fiscal damage to Sony?
Homebrewing your devices for non-piracy means is completely legal. However, the release of the public keys was definitely completely unethical, primarily because of the financial and fiscal damage that it did to Sony as a corporation.
When I buy a device from Sony or any company, I can do with it whatever I want. And Sony has a track record of not allowing people to do that. And when the Fail Overflow guys released the Sony private keys, that's what they were enabling. Piracy was available on the PlayStation 3 before they released the private keys, and it'll be available after they release the private keys. All they were doing was allowing people like myself to run Linux on their PlayStations, and that's not a crime.